Hello, everyone. This is Joni McGarry. Thank you so much for tuning in. During the pandemic, did you wonder why the public health response to this coronavirus was very different than anything we'd ever seen in our lifetime, or indeed had read about in pandemic history? Did you wonder why the measures that public health institutes were taking seemed to run counter to all of the things that they previously embraced as being right and sound and effective during any kind of epidemic or outbreak? Our guest today, Debbie Lerman, wondered and began to do her research. She published several articles on the topic at the Brownstone Institute and on her personal Substack, and also has written a book called The Deep State Goes Viral. We talk about the pandemic response today in this program. She tells us what she thinks it was, why she thinks it wasn't operated out of public health, but was rather driven by national security, why that matters. And she also talks about the growing pandemic preparedness response industry and why we need to keep an eye on that, and how their messaging is simply false. She has an idea for a book she wants to write called The Happy Birthday Town, which is a metaphor for this pandemic response, which I think is just brilliant. I thought of that idea when I recently read about Trump's idea for a big birthday celebration for our country. Anyway, without further delay, I'd like to tell you a little more about Debbie and then bring her onto the show. Debbie was a medical and science freelance writer in the decade before the pandemic and also a visual artist. She has a degree from Harvard University and has a keen sight for trying to find the truth about a situation that just doesn't make sense to her. She is an articulate and insightful person and a delight to talk to. So without further delay, I'd like to welcome Debbie Lerman to the show. I'd like to welcome to the show Debbie Lerman. Hi, Debbie. Welcome, and thanks for joining me here.
Hi, Joni. Thank you so much for having me. I'm really honored to be here.
Oh my gosh, I'm so honored to have you. I really want to talk about your book, The Deep State Goes Viral, um, and because I think it's a very important piece of work to help us understand what the COVID pandemic response really was, and also why it's important that we know what it was or understand it better in terms of how we move forward in the world where they're telling us that pandemics are, always around every corner and some kind of response is going to be necessary. So, with that, if you'd like to introduce yourself in any way and tell us more about you, or just jump right into your book and how you came to get writing it, that would be great.
Sure. Thanks. So yeah, I am now a freelance kind of journalist writer on Substack, and I was a fellow, or I still am a fellow at the Brownstone Institute. And the Brownstone Institute also published the book, The Deep
Hmm.
State Goes Viral.
Right.
So, without their support, I wouldn't have been able to do any of this work, and I'm very grateful for that. And starting in about 2022, I started publishing articles on Brownstone about COVID and the pandemic response. And the book is a collection of some of the articles that I wrote about it. And the first two chapters are um, a summary of the bigger picture, why I think it's important, and what I think the global trends are that the pandemic response represents. So the book is really a picture of what I think is happening in the world, who's in control, who's doing what, and why. And that those conclusions are based on all the research that I did around the COVID response. And that's what all the other chapters in the book are. So I would say if you just read the first three chapters of the book, you'll get a very big, broad picture what I think is going on. And then if you go further, you can dive into all the detailed research that I did about the response.
And I can say that it's a very accessible book. It's not just a tome of scientific information, all footnoted and complicated to read. It's really your journey on
Yeah.
how you said, "Well, Jesus doesn't make sense. Let me learn more about it." And then you did meticulous research on it. Let me ask you, what prompted you when all of this started unfolding? What prompted you to question what was being told to us by our government and by our media, that this was a highly threatening novel virus, and we had to take these extreme measures. Once lockdowns got rolling or flattening the curve, we started to behave in ways, or the government started to require that we behave in ways that were very different from a normal viral outbreak that we've seen in our lifetimes. And so I'm wondering what got you interested in doing this kind of research, or had you always been involved in such research, say, in the decade prior?
No, I was not involved in that research or anything resembling that at all. I was doing visual art
Hmm.
the entire decade before COVID. Before that, I was a medical writer and a science writer for many years. So my background is in writing, not necessarily journalism, but it was more in kind of marketing and website
Hmm.
writing. And I worked as a freelancer. So I worked for a lot of different kinds of organizations and companies, for pharmaceutical companies and for government agencies and for nonprofits. So I had a lot of experience kind of explaining scientific information
Hmm.
to an audience of not necessarily of non-scientists.
Hmm.
So trying to explain complicated scientific material in an accessible way to non-scientists. So that was my background. And so I was comfortable and familiar with scientific literature, also with statistics, and kind of looking at scientific articles in scientific journals. My husband also is a doctor, so he always could help me, with the more complicated stuff. When they started reporting about this novel coronavirus in China, I guess in early 2020, I looked
Hmm.
up statistics to see how deadly it was. And it was reported in January and February that it was mostly affecting old people, didn't affect children, didn't seem to be terribly dangerous. So I said, okay, then that's fine. So we're going to respond to it the way that we responded to everything SARS, MERS,
Hmm.
every kind of outbreak ever in the history of humanity.
Hmm.
Basically, if there's an outbreak of severe cases, meaning not severe cases, just cases, people who are sick and need treatment,
Who have
then
actual symptoms,
right,
who are
then
who aren't just
right,
mildly stuffy.
right, then we'll deal with that because the only way that you can recognize an outbreak of a disease is if people get sick.
Hmm.
There's no other way. They changed that during COVID, and we can talk about that later when
Hmm.
they decided that a positive result on a test meant something about the disease outbreak. But that had never been the case before. You always wait until somebody gets sick, and then when somebody's sick, you test them. And what happened in China, and what always happens is there's an outbreak of pneumonia or flu-like. It's a flu-like illness. There's an outbreak. They test the people who have the disease to see if the pathogen that is causing their disease has been recorded
Hmm.
as one of the flu viruses that we know about.
Hmm.
And if it's not a virus that has been recorded anywhere, we've never seen this virus before, then they say, oh, this is a novel virus.
Hmm.
That's how they do it. And so in China, there were clusters of flu-like illness that did not match any of the known flu viruses. And they said, okay, so there's an outbreak of a novel flu-like virus, and we're calling it the novel coronavirus. So it's not a big deal. It's never a big deal when that happens.
Hmm.
And so when in March, and that's what they were saying too. In January and February, it's okay. It's crazy. They're overreacting. The lockdowns in China are insane. We don't need to
That was
mask.
what our public health officials were saying.
That's what they
It
were
was an expression, it was a message of calm, and all of the things they were talking about were traditional public health messaging
exactly.
for
And the
something like
number
this.
one rule, that's right. The number one rule in traditional public health is don't panic
Mhm.
because panic makes everything worse. That's
Yes.
a known fact. And it is written in all the books. The first thing you do is calm the public down and say, don't panic. Here are the facts. You give them the actual facts. And then you say, wash your hands, stay home if you're sick,
Mhm.
and don't worry about it. We'll deal with the clusters. If there's a big outbreak and, it overwhelms our hospitals in like one area,
Mhm.
it doesn't happen everywhere simultaneously ever. That is
Mhm.
not a thing. There's a cluster somewhere and there's a lot of people going to the hospital. We'll expand our capacity and we'll deal with it. That's what we do when there's a bad flu season, and
Mhm.
that's what we're going to do now. That's it. That's all.
So,
That's
okay,
the entire public health response.
and so that was happening, and then all of a sudden, it seemed like it wasn't happening. And is that what tell me about your experience there, and did that make you raise an eyebrow or wonder, "Hmm, this seems weird?" Or did you, like so many other people, myself included, think, now I'm embarrassed to say it, "Oh, this must be such a unique virus that we have to approach it in such a different way." Because for a bit of time, I really believed that.
Mhm.
So what
No,
was your tell me what happened with you?
I actually had an enormous existential crisis in March 2020 because I knew that it wasn't serious, and I knew that all of a sudden, the entire media that I
Mhm.
trusted, the New York Times and NPR, was lying.
And
I
they were
knew it
all in lockstep.
in lockstep. They were all lying, and I couldn't understand why.
Mhm,
And I couldn't understand why, I had a game with my kids where I would, I used to listen to NPR all the time, and I said, "I'm gonna turn it on, and we're gonna count the number of seconds before they say coronavirus, pandemic, whatever," and it was always 30 seconds, less than a minute, no matter when you turn on the radio, and I was like, "This topic, why are they focusing on this topic? This topic
mhm,
is not that important." And then when they decided to shut down the entire economy and had $3 trillion, like, print $3 trillion out of the air in order to keep the economy shut down, and I'm not an economist, and I used to be I used to call myself, I don't use these terms anymore, but I would call myself a liberal
mhm,
Democrat.
mhm,
So I was all for, government helping, and I'm not against government spending, but
mhm,
that to me was the craziest thing I had ever heard in my life.
mhm.
They close down an economy, something we've never done for any reason, not even wars, and then you make money out of nothing in order to keep the economy shut down, and I said, "If we have 2 to $3 trillion that we can just throw around, why aren't we using 2 to $3 trillion to overhaul the healthcare system, to
Wow, what a great
overhaul the
question.
to overhaul the educational system, to overhaul the infrastructure. If we have that money, why are we using it to shut down the economy over a stupid virus?" Like that to me, really, I think was maybe the biggest shock. And
Mhm,
I expected the writers in the New York Times who I trusted, like Paul Krugman, Nobel Prize laureate, um, economist, to of course come out again and say this is the craziest thing I've ever heard. But they didn't.
mhm.
They did the opposite. Paul Krugman, I think it was like March 26th. I mean, I cried, actual tears, when I read his editorial about how the Republicans are trying to kill people because they care more about keeping the economy open than about protecting people from the virus. And I thought, we're in deep, deep trouble now. We're just in deep trouble because this means that the entire, intellectual class, academic class, medicine, they're all acting completely in the opposite way of uh what you would expect to in order to make things better. They're making things worse, and they're
Yeah,
all together doing it, and that scared me a lot. So
because
I didn't have a moment of thinking that I wasn't scared of the virus. I was scared of the response, and so that's when I started going nuts and saying like, "Well, this response is crazy." And then when they started masking children, um,
toddlers.
and doing, torturing kids, with not letting them play outside. I mean, to me, things that you do to children, I mean, it's terrible what they did to old people. Horrible, horrible things were done to old people and their families, and dying alone and killing them in hospitals with horrible protocols. But when you torture kids, something's wrong with your society.
Mhm.
That's very, very troubling. So I was extremely troubled by that. And people were going along with it, and I was having shouting fights with people all the time because I live in a very liberal, so-called neighborhood.
Yeah, and I think what it was really sad about this whole situation is it became politicized so quickly, and it's not a political issue, but and I think maybe it was because Trump was such a polarizing figure. I think there was a big push. Like, let me just go back to what you were saying about the New York Times and their reporting on it. It seems like nobody was asking questions, but rather they were just hopping on the bus of, what the narrative being pushed was. And I think that also helped make it more political, of an issue. I guess I want to go back to that. So you see all this happening, you're very upset. You're seeing a whole society just not ask questions about it. And also there be, and I think at the same time, your people around you aren't asking questions, but the intellectual movers and thought leaders of our time were also not asking questions. So that there was no robust debate about this response and were we doing the right thing? Um, so did you decide at that point you were going to start researching what was happening beyond below the surface? Like, I think many people argued at that time, well, we didn't know. And I still have friends who will say they didn't know, mistakes were made, they really thought it was dangerous. And I would argue, I mean, probably you would too, is it was very early on that they knew it wasn't so dangerous. So it didn't make any sense. But so when you started looking at it, tell me more about the work you were doing and how that led to the questions you asked in your book.
So yeah, I mean, it took a while for me to actually start investigating it in a journalistic kind of thorough way because in March 2020, I was still an artist. I didn't have a platform. I started writing letters to newspapers. I started contacting like the science writers at the Philadelphia Inquirer. I started contacting the school district. I started fighting with every institution that I was affiliated with, including my kids' colleges. I mean, it was crazy. I was just going nuts, fighting every way that I
It
knew. I
were
wasn't investigating.
terrible.
It was awful.
Yeah.
But I would wake up every morning and see something terrible in the newspaper and start making phone calls or, completely with not a lot of good results,
Mhm.
obviously.
Mhm.
Uh, but what happened was, when I found Brownstone, and that was, like, in late 2021, early 2022, I sent them a letter that I had written to an art institution that I was fighting with about mask mandates and vaccine mandates, and when they accepted the letter, and I had a platform, then all the stuff that I'd been writing to newspapers and they hadn't been publishing and all of that, I sent to Brownstone, and so I started having a platform, and that gave me a reason
Mhm.
actually to start investigating what actually happened.
And what these
And
letters what was your central thesis of these letters? Were you just, walking them through why their, draconian policies made no sense? Were you pointing out the science behind the public health? Because I know in my own experience when, we formed No College Mandates and we wrote all these letters to all the trustees of colleges and the administrations, I really thought they would say, "Oh,
right.
wow, we hadn't looked at it that way. Thank you so much for bringing us the data." But of course, they just parroted back, CDC talking points. But was that your argument in your letters? And was that your jumping off point on asking more questions?
So yeah, my point in my letters, the one I had one success and that was the one that in the letter that I shared with Brownstone. So I was writing to the board of this art institution that I had been very active with in Philadelphia, and I said, "Here's why mask mandates and vaccine mandates are bad," and I gave some scientific background about it, and then
Mhm.
I also said, "And by the way, vaccine mandates are racist." Um,
Which was an excellent way to approach it, especially if you're trying to talk to people on the left who were previously concerned with marginalized populations and not understanding the deep seated skepticism that that community might have over government interventions that were supposed to be good for you.
and not understanding that the impact of the measures was, affecting those communities
Yes.
so much worse. I mean,
Yes.
just absolutely devastating the communities that the liberal, establishment said that they
Mhm.
cared about. It was astonishing.
Yes.
So I said, in Philadelphia, the lowest vaccine uptake is among communities of color, and I showed them the graphs,
Mhm.
which was true. And so if you are doing vaccine mandates, you are excluding mostly people in the communities that you say you wanna support, and that's racist.
Mhm.
And so they stopped with the vaccine mandate.
Oh, congratulations. That's great. So
You gotta know your audience.
and so
So
at this point at this point you're starting to see the response. You're it doesn't make sense. It's kind of bananas. Did you have any idea at that time that your question would become who's really running this pandemic response? Because it had the optics of being run out of our public health in institutions. And in your book, you start to shine the light on. what if it was actually driven by a national security effort versus a public health effort? So, can you sort of start to, in a very elementary way, walk somebody through why those questions arose for you and perhaps questions they could pose to look at the response differently for two reasons? Number one, many people are still sort of reeling and saying, well, that didn't make any sense. The testing, the numbers, the lockdowns, they didn't really make any sense. But then other people are saying, um, just mistakes were made. We're all good now. So I think it's important to start setting the table for people to sit down and look at it differently.
Yeah, that's a good those are good questions. So I started out understanding, I think the first questions that have to be asked maybe to go all the way back to the beginning is what makes sense in terms of a public health response to a novel disease outbreak?
Hmm.
What is a public health response?
Hmm.
So what I started doing is I started researching what are public health agencies, what are the documents that they have that say what they are going to do if there is a novel disease outbreak, like an epidemic or a pandemic. And I started to look at what those plans look like.
I
And
mean, plans for, say, the CDC and
CDC,
our public institutes of health, NIAID,
mhm,
all of
mhm,
that.
WHO, World Health
Okay.
Organization, all of them said basically what we said before. We're going to take care of clusters of cases. We're going to tell keep people calm. Travel bans don't work because when a virus is already circulating in a population, it doesn't help to shut down and economic shutdowns don't work. It's actually exacerbates everything. It
So that was
exacerbates
common, documented
common.
procedure before
Yes,
that. Okay.
absolutely common and absolutely documented. And so, that might be the first place for people to start to see, and there's the 3rd chapter in my book is what would have happened if we had responded
Hmm.
to COVID as we had responded to outbreaks forever. And what would have happened is, um, no, you probably the worst outbreak that we had before COVID was an H1N1, I think, um, where, maybe, some tens of thousands of people died. Okay, that's the worst that we've ever had, ever, ever, ever. And the reason that they always like to talk about the Spanish flu, which is all of a sudden you heard during COVID. I remember in the first few days when I was trying to talk to my friends and say, "Isn't this crazy?" And they didn't think it was crazy. They were like, "No, it's the Spanish flu." I want everybody to understand the Spanish flu happened before there were antibiotics,
Correct.
and most of the deaths happen in these cases from secondary infections like pneumonia that can
Hmm.
be cured with antibiotics. So
And also,
there's no
I understand that there was some iatrogenic harm in that they were overdosing aspirin to these
that's one
patients.
theory. That's one
Yeah.
theory.
Oh,
I'm not
okay.
gonna I'm not gonna say that I know for sure. I know that theory, and that's
Okay.
possible, but you don't even need to go
You
there.
don't need there because you're right. We didn't have antibiotics. Period. The end.
Period, the end. And you just have modern medicine and hygiene and stuff like that,
Right.
okay? And it was war. So or just in the war and post-war. So it's just complete from 1918 after the Spanish flu for 100 years. They like to tell us, and this is extremely, extremely important. It's possibly one of the most important points for people to know the facts because it impacts not just our understanding of COVID, but our understanding of what they call now pandemic preparedness moving
Mhm.
forward. And that is that there has never been a threat of a viral disease causing a pandemic, meaning a worldwide massive death and illness event. There just hasn't because we know how to take care of it.
Mhm.
So there's a really good study that comes out of Brownstone and Leeds University, and
Mhm.
it's by a group called Repair.
It's
And
excellent.
what that shows, and you can look, let's say, so there's a narrative that has been sold and that is repeated in every single pandemic preparedness document and every article that you will read about pandemics. And this is the beginning. The opening sentence is, "We live in an interconnected world in which the risk of pandemics has increased exponentially." That is a lie. That is a outright complete and utter lie. It is based on nothing. It is
Mhm.
based on maybe some computer models or some projections. But if you actually look at the facts, and you look at the 20 years, let's say, where they say this is when, increased travel and increased connectivity between humans and natures and encroachment on natural environments all made it much more likely for, novel pathogens to come from animals to humans and stuff like that. If you look at those years when they say that that was happening, actually, on average, in the 20 years before 2020, with SARS 1, H1N1, um, MERS, Ebola,
Mhm.
all of those together, the average deaths that they caused in the entire world, all of those things, was 10,000 deaths a year. 10,000 a year in a population of 8 billion.
Mhm. It's
Okay. The
minuscule.
percentage is 0. That's a 0 percentage. That's how many people maybe are hit by lightning, maybe,
Mhm.
more are hit by lightning. I don't know, but 10,000 a
Probably
year
more.
is nothing. So that means there is zero threat of a worldwide, massive death event
Mhm.
that's caused by a naturally occurring pathogen coming from nature. Now, you also have to. It's also counterintuitive what they're saying, and it's that counterfactual. It's not factual because the more connected we are, the more we're exposed to pathogens.
Right.
And the more our immune system actually is able to mount responses to more pathogens. So the more we're exposed and we encroach on nature, I'm not saying we're not,
Right.
expanding human presence into all kinds of natural environments that we weren't in before. That actually increases our resistance and
Mhm.
increases our ability to withstand novel disease onslaught on humanity. And if you think about historically, when Europeans came to the Americas, for instance, one of the things that killed half the population was novel pathogens that they had never been exposed to before
Mhm.
because there wasn't any international
Right.
travel.
Right.
Okay. So it's the opposite of the truth that by, expanding our presence and having more connection with nature, that increases the danger. It decreases the danger.
Mhm.
Plus, historically, we see factually, there has never been an outbreak that has caused, massive deaths. The Spanish flu was the last one, and that was pre-antibiotic
Pre-antibiotic.
and
Right.
during the war. So the historic picture that they're trying to paint for us is false. And so anytime I really would love people to know, and anytime you read an article or a book or a report that says there is a huge increased, exponentially increased risk of pandemics in the world, you have to know that that is factually not true. And so if that's not true, then everything else that followed with COVID and that follows with all the pandemic preparedness is based on something that's not public health. So when you ask where did I get to that conclusion? So okay, so it's not public health, right? So none of this is based on anything that is rooted in public health policy or
Mhm.
that's rooted in scientific fact. So it
Let me ju
must be
let me
rooted in
just
something else.
Let me just jump in there, and this is something I would love to cover in more detail, and not maybe in this conversation, but later. I'll point people toward the repair study because I think it's excellent, and it's very, very scientifically rigorous. And so you say, that one statement that we're in this terrible danger now of pandemics all around, just around the corner being a lie. Um, let's just take that as a fact right now. And we can talk about, especially as you get into what this pandemic response appears to have been, why that lie, what could make an organizations, powerful entities such as maybe corporate entities or non-government entities, supranatural organizations, why would they want to lie about something like that? Like what kind of, what kind of
Incentives.
incentive, what kind of economic incentive that might be driving. But for now, let's just put that part aside, like the genesis of that, and just take it as, it's true. There isn't this risk that's being talked about. And then move it back to the COVID pandemic response and what you started uncovering that led you to believe that something else, like a pandemic preparedness response, um, maybe driven by a national security or something other than public health, was unfolding.
Yeah. So it was clear when I looked at the pandemic preparedness plans for public health agencies that that wasn't the COVID response. The COVID response was something else. And what actually got me started, I didn't think I didn't. I'm not a national security person. I really never uttered the words. The CIA, FBI, like just
Right.
those things are things that I never want to think about. I
Well, as
never
a
want.
medical writer, a science writer, it just
Yeah.
wasn't in your purview. Let me just walk back when you said the COVID response wasn't a public health response. Maybe just hit a couple of the highlights of, like, how it was different, like,
So
how.
as we said, if it were a public health response, most people wouldn't know about it. If there were clusters of cases, they would take care of them. They would tell you that there was this novel virus, and if you had cases, you might want to talk to your doctor, but if you had some symptoms. But what happened was, and this was why it was so shocking. All of
Mhm.
a sudden, first of all, they're telling us there's this huge danger. Then they're telling us that this is pandemic is happening everywhere, all over the world, all at the same time, and we have to lock down everything. That's never been done ever for anything,
And they're
let
showing
alone.
us, just dashboards every single day of the counts of everything. It
Now
was
and
like
the
mass
so the
panic.
dashboards, right, so the dashboards are important. So they changed a lot of definitions. They changed the definition of pandemic. So pandemic used to be an outbreak that causes a lot of disease and death, and they just changed it to an outbreak that occurs in a lot of places at the same time of a disease. So it didn't even have to cause a lot of death. They changed, most importantly, the definition of a case. So a case in epidemiology and virology and medicine is someone who has symptoms of a disease. But they change it to a positive result on a PCR test. The PCR test is not intended to actually test whether you
Was
have the disease or
never.
not. So
Yeah.
that was all of those tests were giving us results that were not relevant to whether there was a disease outbreak. And then they were running ticker tapes of how many cases, not how many deaths. They never told us deaths and hospitalizations, if you'll remember. And so
Mhm.
that's another thing that was very striking to me and infuriating. And I couldn't understand why people were not seeing through it. They would say, all these cases, all these cases. If there's a billion cases of a disease, meaning a billion positive tests, and not a single death, then that's not a serious disease.
Right, right.
Okay.
And when you say they were saying, do you mean our the US public health organizations, or was this also unfolding in every country in the same way all at once?
Yes.
See.
Everywhere all at once. Now, I wasn't aware at the beginning.
Mhm,
At the beginning, I was only aware of what was happening in the United
mhm.
States.
Okay.
But as I started researching it, I saw that it was happening simultaneously, identically everywhere, and that this information was also coming from global organizations like the WHO, and that it was being echoed by, a lot of so-called, nonprofits, like the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation,
Mhm, mhm,
uh, you know, and so but I didn't realize that at the beginning. So at the
mhm.
beginning, I just realized that what we were doing was all the opposite and that we were making up definitions and that we were scaring people with case numbers that don't actually indicate the severity of a disease outbreak. It's not even connected, and that everything was being exaggerated and that panic was intentionally being fomented.
Mhm.
Which I thought was really, really scary because if the government is intentionally trying to scare the population, then you have to ask yourself, what's going on? What are they trying? What do they want us to do, and why?
And do you
Uh,
think it could, and some people will, say, and I actually don't think this is the case, but they were so convinced it was a novel virus that it might be a biosecurity threat, like, well, even then, they were saying that it naturally arose from a wet market, but that it was so novel and so deadly that these measures had to be taken. Um, were you starting to see that the people pushing these measures may already have had the information that this wasn't the case, so that it doesn't seem so much like they were really, I mean, I think a lot of people in the effort were really good people, well intentioned. I don't, and believed what was told them, that this was very serious. But the people, say, on the COVID committee, Burks, the thing that Mike Pence set up under Trump, they were pushing this narrative. Tell me what you found out that would suggest that it was not in good faith at
yeah,
some level, that they already knew
yeah,
that
that's
these
exactly
measures didn't have to happen.
right. So that's when I started to look at what you call the national security aspect of this that I was not aware of. So at Brownstone, they asked Jeffrey Tucker, who is the founder and president of
Mhm.
Brownstone, asked if somebody could review the book by Deborah Birx that she wrote about the pandemic. And it's called Silent Invasion.
Mhm.
And why silent invasion? Because she claims that this novel coronavirus started spreading everywhere and it was silent. Nobody knew it because everybody was getting it and nobody was getting sick. Oh my God, what a dangerous virus. So
And we
all
all
right,
bought it. Now when did the book come out, Debbie?
2022.
Okay.
And
So
so it was insane, like, even the very premise and title of the book were insane and wrong, because if it's silent, then it's not dangerous, and if it's dangerous, then it's not silent, so that didn't make any sense. But okay, I had never read a book of nonfiction, from cover to cover because I'm an English major originally, and I only read fiction. I don't really love I think most nonfiction is not well written, it's not well edited, and I can usually get if you just tell me give me a summary and I'll
right.
understand.
Your
You know?
book's pretty well written, though, I have to tell you that.
Oh, thank you.
How about you? I'm with you on that fiction and nonfiction, but go
Yeah,
on.
yeah, I'm not
So
telling people not to read my book. I mean, definitely
book.
definitely
Read her
do.
book.
Uh, but what I'm saying is, I said I decided to read it, and I started reading it, and I was so shocked, that I kind of, eh I had a moment of, I guess, epiphany that there was propaganda being disseminated everywhere through things like this book that was written by the head of the United States government's coronavirus task force. The
Mhm.
entire book was from beginning to end uh, not true, and often like just blatantly false, and a lot of propaganda about the virus that was clearly not intended to tell the story of public health outbreak. It was intended to cover something up, and I wanted to see, and so I could see that she was covering something up, and that she was telling false stories about where she came from, how she
And
got appointed. This is Deborah Birx,
mhm.
appointed to the task force. The minute I saw that she was lying and that she was covering something up, that's when I started looking at okay, what is being covered up here? So
Let
it's
me
not
ask, like
public health. I know it's not public health because I know that it makes no sense in terms of
Mhm.
public health. Everything that she's saying scientifically makes absolutely no sense. There's no way that she can even believe what she's saying. And then she's telling us that she was appointed in this extremely weird and convoluted way when in fact she was actually appointed by the National Security Council.
Mhm.
That's the first time I ever looked into what the National Security Council is. I'm telling you, I was so, so not involved and so naive about all of this. And I looked up what is the National Security Council,
Right.
right? What
Because
is
we
it?
don't think about the thing but let me just go back when you said she was lying, what she was saying didn't hold scientifically. It was just based on the fact that you knew enough about science and viruses and what had happened. When you're reading her book, you're realizing that the tale she's telling doesn't match with what actually happened. Is that how you knew she was, quote, "lying"?
Even before that, yes.
Okay.
I knew from the fact that she said that if everybody was getting sick and nobody had symptoms that it was a I knew that
A
already
riddle.
something was wrong.
Okay.
Maybe she was just stupid, as some people would claim, but that's not
She's
true.
not stupid.
But
Um,
some people would say, "Oh, she's just so stupid." Scott Atlas thinks that. But,
so
I
anyway, she's talking about
even
how she
before that, even before the scientific stuff, the first 50 pages of her book are about how she got appointed to the task force.
right, which is very interesting to me, and so you, came to learn that she was appointed by the National Security Council.
Yeah, but she tells all kinds of tales about how she was appointed. Now, you can read it about it. It's very I don't wanna go into all the details,
Right.
but it's very clear in the book
Yes.
that she's covering something up and that she's lying about other things. And then I compared that to some of the testimony that she gave in Congress, and I compared it to other people's accounts of what happened and how she and none of it lined up. And then I found a video where actually the national security, advisor to the president said, "Yeah, we brought Deborah Birx over."
Okay.
And so I looked up what is the National Security Council. That's clearly not a public health
Mhm.
agency. And it is the body that advises the president. on terrorism and war.
Yes, and
So
in fact, nobody on the council at this point is really interested in has any kind of purview for public health per se.
not at all. Now, that was before they changed the definition of the National Security Council. So
Okay.
they've changed every definition now with COVID and with public health becoming a national security concern
Right,
after COVID. And I have to say, I'm going to back up a second. One of the suspicions that I had was that the reason they were responding to the virus in a way that didn't make sense in terms of public health is because they actually thought it was a bioweapon that had leaked from a bioweapons lab in
right.
Wuhan. And I believed at the time, and now I suspect that that's what happened, but I'm not as interested in it as I was before. But that's what my suspicion was. I thought, okay, it's not a naturally occurring virus. It's actually a potential bioweapon, but potential bioweapon that's not killing a lot of people. But
Right.
still, I thought they were scared
Right.
that this potential bioweapon had leaked, that they didn't want to be held responsible for what would happen, and that's why they responded in such a crazy, hysterical way, and they wanted to lock everything down because it's a bioweapon.
Which
Even though
actually one could argue that, geez, that seems like sort of the responsible thing to do, right? And you can imagine that if that was really earnestly thought of, that this would be a kind of response that would be mounted.
so if they told us that that's what they were doing,
Right, but they didn't.
if they didn't tell us that this was a public health response to a naturally occurring virus, if they said, "Oh my god, we think that a bioweapon might have leaked and now we're gonna shut everything down because we think it's a bioweapon," I still don't think that that would have been an appropriate response because you could see that the virus wasn't killing.
Right,
Like,
and it also would
you
have
have
been
to look at what the virus is doing. Yeah, even if it's leaked from a bioweapons lab, that doesn't mean that it's behaving in a it doesn't mean anything until you see what the virus is doing.
mhm,
Very quickly, we saw that the virus wasn't dangerous. It
mhm.
was spreading fast. It was killing some old and sick people, and that's it. And so, um, I think it would have been more, understandable to people if they had said, "Okay, we're locking down, everything now because we think it's a bioweapon, and we're gonna make sure that this bioweapon isn't killing a lot of people, and then we'll open back up
Mhm.
because it clearly wasn't killing a lot." So that was my suspicion. So I did have a suspicion that they knew it was or thought it was a bioweapon and that they were responding as they would respond to a bioweapon
Okay.
instead of responding to just a regular, naturally occurring virus. So
Okay, so that would be why national security would be involved.
that would
At
be
that
my
point, this is your thought. Now keep going on what you're
exact
finding.
exactly. No, that's good because that brings me back to my thought process back then, which was, okay, so it doesn't make sense in terms of public health. It doesn't make sense in terms of a novel, naturally occurring virus. It makes sense in terms of a bioweapon,
Mhm.
maybe. And then Deborah Birx is coming from the national security apparatus, and she's in charge of the task force. So that kind of lines up. So that means that this is a national
Oh, you
issue,
just you're
not a novel coronavirus issue.
mhm.
So then I thought, okay, so now let's see what is the government's plan for bio warfare and bioweapons attacks. And so then I went down a whole other path, which is the biosecurity plans of the government. And the biosecurity plans and the biodefense plans have to do with if there's a bio warfare or a bioterrorism attack, what do we do? And
Okay.
those plans I summarize as lockdown until vaccine. So, what you do if there's an anthrax attack, let's say somebody puts anthrax in the subway system in New York,
Mhm.
and there's a whole bunch of anthrax everywhere, and you don't know how many people are affected or what's going on, and you have to send in first responders. So you lock down the area. It's a small area, right? Because you can't put anthrax over the whole world. You put it in a particularly small area, and you're going to send in the first responders. You're going to see what the impact is. You're going to try to help as many people as you can, and that's it, and it's going to be over.
Mhm.
That's the response. Um, it is not a response that has ever been intended or planned to affect any large geographical area, let alone the entire world. Lockdowns were never intended for an for on a global scale, not in the biodefense plan. So I'm talking about like what you do in biowarfare and biodefense.
Mhm.
Um, and so what it seemed to me happening was they were taking the lockdown until vaccine, and when I say vaccine, I would say lockdown until countermeasure.
Okay.
In the language of biodefense, which is the language of the military and the language of warfare, it's not the language of public health and medicine.
Right.
In the language of warfare and biowarfare, a countermeasure is something that you use against a bioweapon or CBRN, which is chemical, biological, nuclear, and radiological. Any weapon of mass destruction, you need to have a countermeasure against it. And if there's an emergency where somebody just put anthrax all over New York, you need to rush the countermeasures immediately. You can't wait for regulatory approval. You can't wait for good manufacturing. You can't wait to make sure that it's safe and effective. You just have to rush it to the scene. You have to give it to all the first responders,
Because it's such a huge threat.
right? Because it's
Mhm.
huge, it's immediate, it's fast. And so they made laws in order to enable that kind of a response.
And
And
those were made in the form of the PrEP Act, and that was right around 2005, right, in response to anthrax. Do I have that right?
yeah. So first it's emergency use authorization, and then in conjunction with that, it's the PrEP Act. It happened in 2005. In 2005, they made a huge push to pass laws and build a framework for a biodefense response to bioweapons attacks. And that's part of a military-industrial complex looking for problems and trying to build really expensive and massive solutions in conjunction with private companies, which in this case were the pharmaceutical companies.
Mhm.
So basically, back then they need to stockpile, they need to, create countermeasures that can be used against any novel pathogen. How are you going to do that? So they decided mRNA was a great way to do that. Except it never passed any safety test past phase one of a clinical trial ever
Mhm.
for COVID. It was always too dangerous.
And let me just back up for a second, because some people aren't really familiar with why mRNA was perhaps one of the platforms of choice for a bioterrorism or some kind of countermeasure. And it's because the system itself, it's unlike any previous vaccine, which would take years to develop and require dedicated facilities, very expensive to develop. mRNA is like a plug and play system. If once you have the code, the genetic code of what you're trying to fight, you can engineer a solution in the form of a shot, plug it in, produce a lot of it, and you're on your way. Just sort of an overview of that. And I mean, that's not super scientific, but they're just much faster and cheaper to make and can be deployed very quickly. And as far
So
as
that's the fantasy story of it.
yes,
It's
yes,
not that is the fantasy of mRNA. That is not the true story of mRNA, but that is the fantasy of mRNA. That it is some kind of magic platform that you can plug stuff into and that it's cheap and easy. It's not. None of that is true.
right,
But that's the fantasy that they had because they needed or they wanted this quick countermeasure that they could use against any virus. And Tony Fauci actually, in 2001 or two already, he was already put in charge not just of the public health agencies, he was also put in charge of biodefense um,
a
on
twofer.
behalf. Yeah, so he bridged those two worlds, and I don't like the whole focusing on Fauci at all, but he was somebody who was involved in biodefense very
Mhm.
early on, and people don't know that. People think that he's a public health figure. He's not. He's both a public health figure and a very, a lot of the money that he was using and that he was allocating for research was being allocated to biodefense research. And so he said, we're going to have bug to drug in 24 hours. That's the goal, that we're going
And
to
rem-
discover a new bug. And in 24 hours, we're going to have a countermeasure. Now that's utter and complete lunacy,
yep.
fantasy, never gonna happen. Uh, Already in, like, 2017, when you look at the, agencies that do science for the military industrial, complex, so if you look at DARPA,
Mhm.
Defense Advanced Research Projects Agency, so all the agencies that get money to do research for the military and for the CIA, they were doing research on similar on what can we do that's it's called a platform because you like you said, like, we can plug stuff in and it's
Mhm.
gonna be but they were a little bit more conservative and they said, "Okay, maybe 6 months. In 6 months, no matter what pathogen we discover, we're gonna have a countermeasure to that." That is also fantasy.
Well,
That is
yeah,
complete
especially
fantasy.
yeah, it
It is
has no
not
reality currently.
absolutely not possible. So they went from bug to drug in 1 day to 6 months, and then COVID came and none of that had materialized, none of it worked. So mRNA actually, if you do want to develop it, first you have to do years and years and decades of safety and efficacy testing. You have to do that. And they did that. Moderna was doing it and BioNTech was doing it
Mhm,
in Germany. Both of them were affiliated with the military industrial complex of the country in which they were working, and they were being funded by
mhm,
military and intelligence agencies, not public health agencies. And they were in public private partnerships where they were supposed to be creating these countermeasures. And they failed. So mRNA failed. It was always not safe. It never made it past phase 1. Phase 1 in a there's 3 phases of, drug
clinical
trial.
trials, mhm,
Phase 1 is just a safety trial on a small number of people or even on animals. They failed the animal trial. The animals
mhm,
died. The, pregnant animals, aborted. The fetuses died or were malformed. I mean, like, the whole thing was they it was in the trash.
mhm,
So mRNA was pretty much in the trash in terms of, um, being able to be developed into a useful, um, product.
mhm.
But because it had this promise of, like, um,
Drug,
fantasy promise that, like, well, if we can just get it past that initial safety barrier with those pesky regulations and the pesky, like, safety requirements, we can just skip over that,
mhm,
then we can start plugging stuff in and we can start making it really fast and delivering it. And that's also false because you can't make it fast and safe. You can make it fast,
mhm.
but then it's gonna be adulterated. It's gonna be, you know,
Well,
uh
yeah, to scale a product is it when they scaled this so quickly, there was no way it could be consistent or, they didn't have process control. I mean, not because it was this product, just because any product in that kind of scaling, it takes a while to get your process down.
Right, and this
Um,
product in particular is dangerous because it's not actually a vaccine. So they also
right.
redefined what vaccine is. It's a biologic, and a biologic is a product that has genetic material in it.
Mhm,
Any product that has genetic material in it is a different category
mhm.
of medical product that's considered way more dangerous because we don't know what the genetic material is gonna do in our body.
Right,
It's not a dead virus, it's not an attenuated virus, it's not something that's intended to stimulate our immune system. That's not what mRNA is.
right,
mRNA makes our body produce something
right. It makes us into little factories.
that our body wouldn't normally produce.
Right.
That's the
But
purpose of it. Not only does it do that, but in order to make our body do that, it has to be delivered into the cells.
mhm,
And so it has to be um, covered in nanoparticles, which also are extremely dangerous.
mhm,
It also has to be made of substances that are not naturally occurring in genetic material in our bodies. Um, I don't need to get into the scientific detail, but all of those things. So it's dangerous in very, very many ways
mhm.
that a normal vaccine, it doesn't even consider. I mean, it's not
They're
even
not the same thing. They're just called the same thing because 'cause they're both injections. Um,
well actually, they're called the same thing on purpose,
yes.
not because they're both injections
Okay,
at all,
yeah.
because they wanted to because vaccines are the most, beloved
Mhm,
medical intervention. People love them, trust them. And anyone who goes against them, we already have a term for that. It's called anti-vaxxer. And
yeah.
so somebody who went against the mRNA, and I always like to separate the mRNA from other vaccine issues. I've become an anti-vaxxer on all vaccines now, but that's doesn't even matter. I don't even want to talk about the other vaccines when we're talking about mRNA because they are not vaccines at all. They are a different category that was mislabeled as vaccines in order to gain widespread acceptance
Mhm,
and in order to lump it together so that when I say I am again, I think mRNA vaccines should be yanked from the market, you can call me an anti-vaxxer,
right. When
which
that's
is
not yeah, even it's true and unrelated in this
even if you
case.
love vaccines and you think all vaccines are great, mRNA doesn't fit into that category.
Okay, so there's a raft of problems with the mRNA platform, which is, a whole different topic. So so we have this mRNA platform that they appear to want to deploy because they have magical thinking about it. They're ignoring the safety issues. Maybe they're thinking, well, it can't be used as a therapeutic because repeated exposure is bad. But this one and done thing, one jab at the arm, people aren't going to really get that sick. And then we're going to have billions of people who say, all right, this platform's acceptable to me. And then we can use it going forward, which I would imagine was a really motivating factor on shutting down till this product was available to deploy and then to mandate. Um, I don't want to lose our thread here. So you're starting to look into it. You're seeing that this kind of funding is going on for this platform. They have this lockdown until countermeasure, and in this case, that countermeasure was the mRNA injection, which they've relabeled as a vaccine. They redefined the term vaccine at the time. So you're starting to see this, and you're seeing that it's coming out of defense. And maybe at this point, you're thinking, well, maybe they think it's necessary. Did that change too once you started to put the facts in place that the response was being driven out of national security or appeared to be driven out of national security? Um, did you start thinking that, oh, well, it doesn't seem like they really care about the public health situation, that they're trying to put in place these measures? Was it a trial run? Like what would have been their motivation to hijack public health for this particular coronavirus once they knew they didn't have to do that?
Right. No, that's good. Thank you for bringing me back. Uh,
No, I mean,
yeah.
it's so rich, and we're gonna have to have another discussion after this because you have so much knowledge on this, and there's so many rabbit holes that one can go down, and I don't mean like, oh, conspiracy theory rabbit holes. There are just so many elements to this response, um, from, tech, from surveillance, from passports to masks to this product that you would need an hour a day for the rest of your life to cover it. So anyway, but to get back to that, so you're seeing that it's a security response. They're using the public health apparatus to deploy it. They've also got the media on board. I don't know if we can even address that at this point. But go on, you're starting to see this and tell me more about it.
Yeah, so that's a really good point about the vaccine. So at the beginning, so they rolled out the vaccines at the end of 2020 and the beginning of 2021. I wasn't even doing my research then. And I got sucked in because I wanted the whole thing to end. And they said, okay, if you take these things, if you take these vaccines, we're going to stop. No more masking, no more lockdowns. And
Right.
I knew we had to stop with that because that was destroying people's lives and destroying society as we knew it. And
Mhm.
so and they did that on purpose. So then I realized
Well, people were
I
dying to
started
get this new product as a
exactly
result. Like,
that
we're
they
going to fix
created
this.
yes, exactly. They created the circumstances. So lockdown until countermeasure, when it's used on a global scale, is actually a way to get everybody to take the countermeasure in order to end the lockdowns.
Right.
And that's what happened. And so then I realized that, oh my God, and then they started mandating. When they started mandating, that became very clear that something was wrong. Because at that point, even if you thought at the beginning of 2020 that this was dangerous, even if they thought that it was a bioweapon that had leaked from a lab, even if they thought that they were responding to, some kind of bioweapon and that we had to be really careful. By the end of 2020, nobody who looked at the science or the numbers could claim that this was a deadly virus. It was just not possible at that point because it was very, very clear it wasn't affecting children at all. It
Hmm.
was affecting almost nobody under the age of 50. And we had statistics from every country. I mean, I looked at statistics every day throughout 2020 from every country to see what was going on. It just wasn't that dangerous. And there was no way that you could claim at that point, at the end of 2020, that this was so dangerous that we had to mandate this vaccine on children, on pregnant women, that people were going to lose their jobs. It just, that really, really didn't make sense at all.
Okay, so
Um,
if it didn't make sense to you, why wasn't our trusted media, and I don't mean trusted the trusted media initiative, why weren't the outlets that we trusted to educate us and to ask questions about such vital issues, where were they? If you could look at the stats and look at the measures and say, doesn't compute, doesn't add up, why wasn't this front page news on the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, NPR, CNN, Fox? Where were these reporters? What do you make of that? Like, why would they
well,
lie to us?
right. Well, Two answers. One is the easy answer, and it is also a valid answer, which is who owns like 70% of the advertising on all of those outlets,
The
pharmaceutical
the
companies.
pharmaceutical industry, yes. I mean,
Okay.
with
That's you could just take that answer and that would be enough. So
yeah.
they are the advertisers. And the other owners of those platforms, which are people like Bill Gates
Mhm.
and social media companies, and if all of their interests are to keep this going and to make sure that everybody takes the vaccine, nobody is going to be asking those questions.
That's a
So
good
that's just
point.
pure financial interests.
Mhm.
um, I think would explain it. And you can see analogies, if you look at the opioid epidemic, if you look at the way the media is controlled by corporations on a whole bunch of different issues. But that's the big one.
Okay.
So that would be enough. But it wasn't just that, because the propaganda and the censorship started all the way back at the beginning of the pandemic. So all of those reporters from the very beginning were not asking questions and were not challenging the narrative, because everybody, so who owns the Washington Post? Who owns the New York Times? The
Well, Jeff Bezos
how
owns the Washington Post, and when you lock down the economy and you shut down all small businesses, geez, if your company is a mail order company,
Mhm.
and you're not shut down, you still stand to benefit. I mean, that's a very simple explanation, that people, like, when you look back, like we talked about, weapons of mass destruction, you look back at, other things in the press that were not covered factually, where people didn't go after the truth. Um, there's no reason to think that this would have been any different, especially if there were big motivations afoot. And you mentioned the censorship, social media. That's another whole area that now we know that we have documentation that the government was pushing these organizations such as Twitter to shut down any robust debate on this issue. Which also you could say, well, they did that because they wanted to keep everyone safe. I don't think I think our First Amendment rights should definitely not be trampled on in that situation. But what it did is it shut down debate where people who had real credentials and who were really seeking the truth were silenced. And the problem with that, and I'm kind of just getting my own little message in here, is censorship is beautiful. It's so elegant because you don't even know it's happening. You're just not hearing something that you might have already heard. I mean, most people I know in real life have no idea how much censorship went on and continues to go on, I think. But anyway, so wow, we're at an hour already and we're not even like getting to the real meat of the thing. I don't want to take too much of more of your time, but like, where do you want to go from here in terms of what you learned and sort of like, where you landed and why it is so important to look at this response for going forward in our world because we're still under an emergency, which is blows the mind. Like we are still under the COVID emergency, and that's a federal thing. We're still under it. PrEP Act is still in place for countermeasures.
Let's be specific. So we're not under an emergency for COVID, like from
Oh,
generally.
okay. Oh,
We're
good. I'm
not
glad
under an
I
emergency
stand
for COVID.
corrected.
Not generally, but we are under an emergency for COVID for the PrEP Act, and the PrEP Act is the law that we discussed earlier that was made for cases of biowarfare and bioterrorism, so that the companies that make the countermeasures that you're going to rush to the scene, they might hurt somebody, they might kill somebody, but you don't want anybody suing the companies because otherwise the companies aren't going to make these countermeasures.
Right.
So that's what it was intended for. It was not intended to protect pharmaceutical companies from any kind of liability on a global scale, for manufacturing products that were never regulated or tested and that didn't go through any good manufacturing processes. But that's what they used it for. So we have been under a state of emergency for COVID, for the PrEP Act, which means indemnity, legal indemnity to anyone who handles any countermeasure for COVID.
Anyone who
Um,
provides it, and that goes to all of the mRNA shots, any shot that was used as a treatment, remdesivir, anything that was brought out to treat or to test the
Mhm.
swabs that went up your nose, the people that put the swabs up your nose, the people that injected, the colleges that mandated. No matter what happened as a result of that, people got injured, and they did. Um, whatever losses were suffered, those victims generally, and there's a tiny little fund for the government to take care of some cases, but that's a different issue. You can't hold any of those manufacturers responsible because it was all
Correct.
done in a state of emergency. Is that
Correct.
it in a nutshell?
And that state of emergency was, retroactively declared to February 4th, 2020, and it is now declared until, the end of 2029. So 10 years. I mean, you tell me, does it look like we're in and when did it's very quickly was clear, and I would say by the end of 2020 that the hospitals weren't overrun,
Hmm.
that it was over. By the end
Right.
of 2020, whatever emergency had happened, even if you believed that it was deadly and you believed that we needed to flatten the curve and you believed all of that stuff, by the end of 2020, it was over. Hospitals were not overrun. We saw that it wasn't affecting most of the population. Then they started, of course, with the variants and all of that, just to make sure that everybody took the vaccine. But what I'm saying is that by the end of 2020, it was clear
Hmm.
that we're no longer in a state of emergency, and yet now we have a state of emergency going until 2029. That is a very particular state of emergency that applies only to the PrEP Act, and it can be undone by one person, the HHS secretary.
And it's not being undone.
Legally,
Right.
the HHS secretary declares the state of emergency with no the courts can't intervene, the states can't intervene. It's a completely unconstitutional law, the
Hmm.
PrEP Act.
Hmm.
But he unilaterally can declare the emergency, and he or she, right now it's a he, can end the emergency. And if he ends that for the PrEP Act, that means that from that moment on, anyone who gets an mRNA vaccine can start suing. And that would mean an end to the use of that countermeasure because, I don't think the companies would want to be,
Of
uh,
course.
administering it or distributing it without that legal protection. So, that can be done tomorrow. It could have been done the day after he came into office, and it didn't happen.
And what do you make of that?
Well, that's the
That's the
huge rab
million-dollar question.
no, that's the huge rabbit hole that if you wanna go into. So I'll just wrap up my conclusion in the book. And so my conclusion is this: it wasn't a public health response. It was a national security response. The national security response was carried out by the deep state. That's why it's called The Deep State Goes Viral. The deep
Mhm,
state is not some kind of shady group of CIA and FBI agents sitting around in a dark room smoking cigars. The deep state is a giant, giant, and it's global now. So it's a global conglomerate of corporations, of NGOs, of academic institutions, and government and global governance agencies all together acting in order to get themselves, those organizations, I'm going to call it just the cabal, in
mhm.
order to get themselves more power and more resources. That's it. It's not a conspiracy because that's what happened. These corporations created public-private partnerships with governments, with non-governmental agencies, and with all the institutions that I mentioned in order to further their agenda,
Mhm.
get more money and more power. Now, all the corporations that are involved in this are also media and also Silicon Valley and also surveillance companies. And so there's many agendas that kind of come together here with COVID, and that's a different discussion. But all of those agendas came together to create this conglomerate that then had all of these reasons and incentives to lock down until vaccine. So
Mhm.
the lockdowns helped with, like you said, with the digital economy. And if you look at how certain people that I'm going to call globalists, people who are interested in global governance and in sort of the dissolution of national states in favor of global organizations, they were very happy with the response because it dissolved a lot of mom and pop shops, local businesses, local cohesion, and it moved everything up to the global level or up to like the supranational level, like you said, like Amazon. The
Mhm.
big stores in the United States were allowed to stay open for some
Mhm.
unfathomable reason while all the little shops had to close.
Mhm.
The biggest transfer of wealth ever in history happened. About 3 trillion, I forget how many trillion dollars went from the lower and middle classes to the upper
Right.
0.001%. In developing countries, it was absolutely devastating. They had no COVID, they had no morbidity or mortality from the disease, but they had starvation and they had
Mhm.
an enormous loss of education, an increase, in child trafficking and sexual abuse and all of those terrible things.
Well, all those things happened here as well. I mean, it wasn't just in impoverished countries. I mean, the laptop class happily formed their little school pods and, worked from home. And anybody without income, or people working families, these kids were locked out of school, out of all the, and I mean, whether schools, that's another topic. But yeah, the poor in our country
Yes,
were
yes,
really devastated by that.
really.
But just to make a note for somebody who, maybe isn't as far into this, as you
Mhm.
say, this, conglomerate where their interests were served, people would say, "Oh, that can't happen," because maybe they're imagining it to be like you said, cigar smoking people at the top of this conglomerate, but anyone can just look at if they've ever been in a corporation or in an organization, even if it's a nonprofit, whatever, you're really jazzed about your thing. And you need your organization to have more money, to have sustainability, to have success. And so that's your mindset. And if a situation presents itself that's fueling that, you're just not as inclined to kick the tires on it, not because you're a bad person or because you're evil or you're trying to advance a bad agenda, even if it turns out to be bad, it's because that's just a natural thing. You're on your team, you're working for that. I mean, and I'll say that, I've worked with a lot of people in the pharmaceutical industry. They're some of the finest, best people I know. And I worked in pharma and I know what it's like to be on a team. You don't ask certain questions, not because you've decided not to ask them, just because you're advancing your own thing. So I just want to say that to anybody who would say that kind of international conglomerate, cohesive thing, that web can't exist. It does exist. You just have to think about smaller examples in your own life.
And
I
yeah,
just want to make
that's a
that
really good
point.
point. That's a really good point. And actually, in the book, in the first chapter, um, there's just a chart of the all the organizations and corporations that are in what I call the biodefense global public-private partnership. None of it is a conspiracy. I mean,
Hmm.
it's all factual. Um, and and like you said, if you don't mind, I'm going to tell a little story. Maybe
I
this
don't
will
mind at all.
okay. That I am thinking about writing in order to explain exactly what you said. The fact that once a whole society or a whole giant um, conglomerate, like we're talking about, coalesces around a particular issue, like you said, like our topic, our thing, it doesn't matter. It doesn't take any evil motivation at all, and it doesn't take any conspiracy in order for that to snowball
Hmm.
to, that interest all of a sudden taking over and dominating and crushing and destroying everything else. And so what I call it Happy Birthday Town. And the story of Happy Birthday Town is that once upon a time there was a regular old town, and it was the mayor's birthday. And oh my gosh, and the mayor's wife was like, "Oh my gosh, we really want to celebrate the mayor. Probably the whole town wants to celebrate the mayor. Let's have a big birthday party for the mayor." And so she got, the local party business and the florists and the catering and the music, and she put on this great thing. She used some city funds and she also did some fundraising. Maybe there was a little bit of, maybe not 100% over the table using some municipal funds, but not terrible because it was for the town and it was,
For the mayor.
for a good cause and for the mayor, and everybody was happy and everybody came to the party and it was great. And all of the businesses were really happy, and because they got some influx of money from the city coffers and from, the citizens who came to the party, and the citizens were happy. And so they decided, well, we're going to make this an annual event. And also, let's think of other ways that we can boost our birthday party industry because it seems like we have a really great birthday party industry in this town. And so they started finding ways, like schools started celebrating, on every certain dates, all the kids who had birthdays on that date.
Hmm.
Then they started mandating that people actually report to the city when their birthday is so that they can add it to the celebration. And then all of the industries in the city, in the town, started focusing more and more on this birthday thing because that started happening more and less on other things. And then they started looking for other reasons to have these birthday parties. And soon, every single day, there was a reason to have a birthday party. People didn't wanna do it anymore. It was exhausting. It was tiring. They weren't doing the doctors weren't doctoring, and, the teachers weren't teaching, and the kids weren't getting the education they wanted. But the birthday industry was the industry that was actually fueling the town. They actually now were paying for the, politicians, to get elected. They were supporting the civic projects that
Hmm.
the city hall wanted to do, so they were being civic minded and giving money for parks and stuff with, like, big signs about they
Hmm.
changed the name of the town to Happy Birthday Town, and everybody who came to the town now had to say when their birthday was, and had to contribute to the birthday fund in order to help celebrate everybody's birthday. So if you think about that, just on that little town scale and that one really wonderful cause of happy birthday and how easily
Yeah.
that can turn into a machine that serves the interests of the businesses and the government officials and the rich people who are funding it and who wanna get more money and more interest in that subject, it makes the town famous for that, so now
Hmm.
everybody can come, and now businesses that do birthday stuff from all over are gonna start coming to that town.
Hmm.
And so you can see how it just
Sure.
it's organically happens that when you focus on something, you're gonna look and the rich and powerful people who are focused on that, or the companies or the government agencies, and they all come together to work together because
Hmm.
it's in their best interest to have public-private partnerships. So the businesses in this town and the politicians in this town were both gaining a lot from celebrating birthdays every day and forcing people to celebrate birthdays every day. And so they were working together, and the people could no longer elect someone who didn't wanna do that because
They
all
couldn't
the
even get funding.
and all the money were already
Yeah.
going to it. That's where we are.
Yeah.
That's where we are. So that's where we are with any interest that brings together global corporations and governments and nonprofits and all of that,
Hmm.
and biodefense is one of the biggest
Hmm.
of those industries. So I think if you move that little birthday story to the global level and you take birthdays and you translate it into biodefense, you get pretty much, a similar effect.
That's a really great metaphor for that. Yeah, if we are gonna wrap up, because we didn't really get all the way to the end of it, but and will well, you have to say yes now, 'cause I'm gonna ask you, will you come on again to
Of
talk
course.
more about this? Um, so right now we're in a situation where that PrEP Act state of emergency is still going. We appear to have all of the apparatus of what ran the COVID response in place, right? Because now they've established what works, what people will do, because most people were very compliant. And so they were collecting all that data all the time, like who was compliant, who wasn't, how many needles did we get in arms, how many people masked, where the mandates worked, where they didn't. So all that data has been collected, and it's not being thrown away. We now have digital ID, we have all of these things. And an industry like the happy birthday industry that is now they want to celebrate pandemics all the time. They want
Exactly.
everyone to have a pandemic. And again, I'll put the show notes in the show notes, the repair study. Um, what do we do now, to prevent this kind of lockdown and this kind of lockstep response that injured so many people? You know, what what can a person do?
So the best thing to do is just to tell people. So what you're doing and what I'm doing, if everybody knows, if a large percentage of the population resists, it's
Mhm.
not gonna
Yeah. Well,
if if
that's the
everybody in
hope.
Happy Birthday Town, if everybody, all the citizens in Happy Birthday Town got together and said, "We're not gonna celebrate birthdays anymore. We're not gonna pay for it. We're not gonna go to the parties. We're not gonna give the information about when our birthdays are," then either it would fall apart or the town would have to send its police force to force people to do it. Now, if we can get them to do that, so if enough people resist that they have to use overt military force, which they did do during COVID, but only in like specific places that had big demonstrations and places like Australia, that'll make it more overt. Then people will see that this is not being done in their best interest.
Right.
They'll see that this is not actually a public health or a good faith public interest effort. That that the beneficiaries of this effort are not the public.
Mhm.
Once the public understands that, so you and I can try to tell people. That's number
Mhm.
one. If anybody listening to this can convince anybody of anything that we said, that will be a good step. I think informing is the most important thing because I think if people are informed, then they aren't going to comply. And if everybody doesn't comply, then it doesn't work.
Mhm.
Doesn't work, then they have to show their force. So then the global public private partnership, the conglomerate, or the happy birthday town has to get mean. And if they get mean, then people will realize what's going on.
Yeah, it's I think about, like, the draft, right? I mean, part of the reason they abolished the, conscription, the draft in this country is because it engendered too much protest to war, and so, I think they'll never bring the draft back because then people will say, "Wait a minute, we're not down for this war." And, I think you're right. I think if they keep it all so soft and it's in your best interests, people don't wake up. I hope it doesn't have to get that far.
Now
And
I also want to just add, I don't actually think, believe it or not, after all this work that I've done on pandemics, that pandemics are going to be the next thing because I think Happy Birthday Town, one of the weaknesses of Happy Birthday Town is that it only has one thing that it's working towards, and it's easy for people to see that
right,
that thing is not is kind of like preventing them from doing other stuff.
right,
So I think enough people saw through the pandemic thing that they're gonna not try it on a global level, they might try it on local levels, maybe, I don't know, maybe certain countries or certain areas, maybe. And if they do, I actually do think that there is enough awareness, that there will be enough resistance. But I think that what they're gonna do, and what they're already doing, is they're gonna use the same framework to try to create an emergency around something else.
like
That
perhaps a climate emergency or aliens from outer space emergency. I mean, it could take any form. Yeah,
cybersecurity is a big one.
yeah.
They can crash the internet could miraculously or suddenly spontaneously crash,
So
which
could the
could
electrical grid. I mean, it could be something even more basic than the internet. Yeah, we're very vulnerable in
so
our.
I think we're vulnerable, but we also have the power. So the good news is if we are aware, and that's why I'm actually more of an optimist about pandemics, I think,
Mhm.
surprisingly, given all the work that I've done and what I know about it, is the pandemic industrial complex, which is like the birthday party, the happy birthday town. Um, a lot of people have seen through it, and so it will be very difficult for them. They may want to try it again, but I think it'll be very difficult.
Mhm.
I think that it's going to be something that is scary. So it has to scare a lot of people. Fear
Right.
is the number one thing. And if they can scare everybody with something else, like climate emergency, or like you said, some kind of Islamic terrorists, now they can go back to the Islamic terrorist thing, which was what they were doing before. Biodefense was Islamic terrorism, was like the big boogeyman. They can go
Right.
back to that. And people will comply if it's something that they are afraid of.
Right, because when you're in a state of fear, you suspend your critical thinking and discernment. There are so many things that are moving to make us less discerning anyway, even without one big imminent threat. I think, yeah, I think if anything, this kind of information can prompt somebody to just ask, even if it's just one or two questions. Because to me, like my tiny little awakening happened not during COVID. It was the night of the Obama and Romney debate. And I think it might have been the first debate. And I was watching, and I came reliably from the left, although I think I was leaning a little more Romney, and now I I think the left-right paradigm is just completely a useless thing to invest oneself in it. But at the time, I watched the debate and I remember thinking, well, geez, Obama just clearly didn't prepare. He gave a terrible performance. I saw it with my own eyes, and it wasn't because I was really invested in either character. I picked up the New York Times the next day, and that is not what they reported. It and it was small, but I thought, huh, well, are they in the tank for Obama? How could that be? And it was just that one little thing that made me a little more skeptical of the mainstream media,
Mm.
which led to me being able to ask some questions about other things. And I think that's where it starts. It's just to just sort of shake people awake a little bit. And, to get back to your book, the reason why this book is so good is because you just walk through the reader through here is what I learned. Here are the questions I would ask. You have this brilliant back and forth where you make a fake interview with Burks as if you are interviewing her with pertinent questions that people should have asked. And then you're using her own words to, fictitiously answer the questions in her own words. And it's just brilliant. So that's what I would like to leave anyone who listened to this is pick this book up. The Deep State Goes Viral. You have a couple of different ways to buy it if somebody doesn't want to go on Amazon. All your articles are on Brownstone. I would just like to put you on the radar of people listening who maybe didn't experience the pandemic in the same way, but who are reflecting and thinking, huh, what really happened there? Like, it's like waking up from some crazy fever dream,
Yeah. No.
truly.
And like I think you and I were talking before, I think you that's a really interesting wake up moment that you had.
So,
Um
so
I
tiny.
wasn't I wasn't even paying attention, but I think a wake up moment that a lot of people have had was when everybody realized, including all Biden supporters, realized that the media was all in lockstep lying about Biden,
Yes.
about his health. I think that's a really good starting point. Why? Uh, and if they could lie about that, is it possible that they could lie about other things?
Right. And of course it is. And I think part of the thing somebody has to do is they have to realize that you have to put your political um, orthodoxy or your scaffolding aside and try to approach things that are being reported in a more discerning manner without falling into like Trump derangement syndrome or like MAGA, MAGA, MAGA. They're just two sides of the same coin, as I've been saying recently. And you're right. Like it was so clear that there was something wrong with Joe Biden. It was, but I had friends who had voted for him who just refused to believe their own eyes and then just completely believe the press saying, "Oh, he just has a stutter." I mean, who was president for during that time? I mean, why was the press lying about it or covering up?
And how
You
is
know?
that not a national security disaster that not only the press was covering up, but
Yeah,
the entire everybody who knew
yeah,
Biden and worked with him, the entire government was covering up.
yeah. Where
Yeah.
was the National Security Council during that emergency?
And where
Right?
was the vice? You know that it's the vice president's uh, prerogative and role. Like the vice president doesn't have a lot of jobs. Actually
They have
defending
one job.
not a lot in the Constitution, but the one job is to make sure that the president is competent.
Yeah. So I mean, that's a whole different topic.
Yeah,
Anyway,
but the skepticism, I think, is
yes,
what we're trying to say is be skeptical. And
right.
actually, what I would also like to add to that is that your and your family's health and life could depend on it.
Yes,
So
and it does.
when you hold on to partisan ways of looking at things, and this will be my last story, tiny anecdote. When I, at the very beginning of the pandemic, would say to people, don't, because I thought everybody knew it was crazy. I didn't realize that people were buying it. And so at the beginning, I said to people, my friends, my very liberal Democratic friends, oh my God, this is so crazy. Can you believe they're making people wear masks for like a respiratory virus? That's never been done and it
Yeah.
doesn't work. And you know what the answer was?
Yeah.
Are you a Trumpist?
That's breathtaking.
Now,
Yeah.
that scared me probably more than anything because then I realized that I couldn't talk to people about facts or reality. So to go back to the skepticism, what I would encourage people to do is if you are looking at things through a partisan lens, you might be ignoring actual facts and
Yeah.
reality that could be dangerous to you. And that might be something that is intentionally being used to distract you from what the facts actually are.
Yes, and that's true on both sides of the so-called aisle,
Both
and
sides.
what you were describing, and then we'll wrap it up, but what you were describing and when you said, "This is bananas, these mask things," and they're like, "Huh, are you a Trumper?" They were also somehow mediaized, propagandized, stirred up, reactionaryized, if that's a word, to respond that way, to shut down discourse.
And
Have
what's
been
most scary, Joni, is that they were my best friends and
Oh,
family. They had known me all my life. So they knew that I was this, like, insane liberal, always voted Democrat. Like,
smart.
asking that question was so nonsensical
Yep.
in the context of knowing me that that's why it scared me, because I understood what you just said, that they must have had their brains were muddled with the propaganda and with the, distraction.
Yeah, I was on, early on in the, college mandate work, I ended up on, Fox and Friends, and then ended up on Ingraham, which, because I called Lester Holt, and he didn't have me on the nightly news, because Fox was having people on, right? Whatever. And I sent the clip to one of my friends, and I said, "I just want you to know what I've been doing." And she immediately sent back, "Well, I'd find it more credible if it wasn't Fox."
Right.
And I was like, "Well, I've known you since 3rd grade. It's me. Those are my words." So it
Mhm.
was people are blinded by their preconceived notions about politics, and so I'm so glad to be free of that. I mean, I still fall into it a little bit, but we must be open-eyed and discerning. We must be.
Yeah.
So anyway, what do you want, how do people find you? Anything you wanna leave, anybody with? Wow, I just thank you so much for this great discussion.
Thank you.
Tell us what
Thank you. I hope I didn't get too sidetracked with all
Oh,
the different
you
routes.
ca you this is a big, this huge ball of yarn, it's we gotta unwind it how we unwind it. So, where can people
Yeah, you can find the, Deep State Goes Viral is on Amazon. It's also, if you don't like Amazon, it's on lulu.com, LULU.com. Pretty much available anywhere in the world, I think,
Mhm.
through that. And then, it's, debbielerman.substack.com and, brownstone.org. You can look for Debbie Lerman, and my articles are also there.
Okay. Are you on X or any social medias?
I don't do social media, and I encourage everybody to get off of social media.
Smart girl. I will put all of the links in the show notes, and I will count on having you back on soon to walk through whatever other aspects of this topic you'd like to talk about.
Thanks. I really appreciate it, Joni. Thank you
All
so much.
right. All right. Thank you, Debbie. Bye bye.